The city rests on a plateau shaped by time and pressure. Its streets follow no strict order, bending slightly with the terrain, adjusting to the quiet irregularities of the ground beneath. Buildings rise close to one another, concrete layered over older foundations, each generation adding weight to what came before. In the early hours, before the full movement of the day begins, the air carries a measured stillness. There are no visible signs of strain. Morning light settles evenly across rooftops. Windows reflect a pale sky. Electrical lines stretch between poles without movement. The ground, at least to those above it, appears fixed and dependable. Traffic has not yet reached its peak. Doors open, close. Routine establishes itself in small, repeated actions. But beneath the surface, the structure is different. The earth here is not a single solid mass. It is divided, segmented by fractures that extend far beyond what can be seen. These faults do not move constantly. They remain locked, sometimes for years, holding accumulated pressure without release. The surface absorbs this tension quietly. Nothing in the environment suggests immediacy. And yet, in places like this, stillness is not absence, it is suspension. At a certain point, unpredictable in exact timing, but inevitable in occurrence, the pressure exceeds what the locked ground can contain. The release does not announce itself gradually. It arrives without visible warning, transferring force upward through layers of soil, stone, and structure. What stands above is not designed to remain untouched. On this morning, like many others, the city continues without interruption. People move through familiar spaces. Walls hold, floors support weight. The assumption of stability remains intact. For now, nothing has changed. In January 2010, Port-au-Prince functioned as the political and economic center of Haiti. The city carried the weight of the country's institutions, its markets, and its population density. Buildings were constructed with urgency rather than uniform oversight. Reinforced concrete was common, but consistency in engineering standards varied widely. Many structures stood through experience rather than calculation. The Enriquillo Plantain Garden fault system runs along the southern part of the island of Hispaniola. It marks a boundary between the Caribbean and North American tectonic plates. Movement along this fault had been historically infrequent in terms of large, recorded events, but geological evidence indicated long periods of accumulated strain. By 2010, that strain had not been released in a major way for over a century. For residents, this absence created a sense of distance from risk. Daily life in Port-au-Prince did not center around earthquakes. Attention was directed elsewhere toward economic survival, infrastructure challenges, and routine obligations. Schools operated, markets opened, and construction continued. Awareness of seismic vulnerability existed in technical discussions, but it did not define ordinary decision-making. Among the thousands moving through the city that week was a man named Evans Monsignac. He worked within the urban environment like many others, navigating narrow streets and multi-level buildings that combined residential and commercial use. Records about his personal history are limited, but it is known that he was inside a structure when the earthquake occurred. The building he entered was not unusual for the area. Concrete floors, vertical supports, and minimal open space between neighboring structures. Like many buildings in the city, it had not been designed with strong seismic reinforcement. Its stability depended on conditions remaining unchanged. At approximately 4:53 p.m. on the 12th of January 2010, the conditions did change. The earthquake measured magnitude 7. Its depth was shallow, approximately 13 kilometers below the surface. The rupture propagated along the fault, releasing energy that had been stored over decades. The motion reached the city in seconds. Structures did not fail uniformly. Some buildings remained standing with damage. Others collapsed almost immediately. The pattern depended on materials, design, and proximity to the most intense shaking. Inside one of these buildings, Evans Monsignac did not have time to exit. There was no extended warning, no gradual escalation. The transition from stability to collapse occurred within a short span of time. Floors shifted, supports gave way. Gravity acted without resistance. The space he occupied was transformed. Above him, the structure lost coherence. Around him, walls fractured into sections. The distinction between rooms, floors, and open areas disappeared as materials fell inward. Dust filled the air, reducing visibility almost instantly. When the movement stopped, the city above had already begun to change. For those beneath the debris, the situation had already become something else entirely. At 4:53 p.m., the first movement was not immediately understood as an earthquake. It began as a vibration beneath the feet, a low, shifting sensation that altered balance. Within seconds, the motion intensified. The ground moved laterally, then vertically. The force traveled through the structure with no delay. Inside the building, there was no time to respond with direction or planning. Concrete does not bend easily. It fractures. The initial shaking caused structural elements to weaken at their joints. Columns cracked under stress. Floor slabs lost alignment. The connections that held the building together began to fail almost simultaneously. As the motion continued, these failures compounded. The collapse was not a single event, but a sequence compressed into seconds. Sections of the building gave way in layers. Upper floors dropped onto lower ones. Walls separated and fell inward. Air was displaced rapidly, forcing dust and debris through confined spaces. Visibility was lost almost immediately. Evans Monsignacq was inside during this process. The exact position he occupied before the collapse is not fully documented, but evidence from rescue accounts indicates that he was caught beneath multiple layers of debris. When the structure fell, it did not flatten completely. Voids, small, irregular spaces formed between collapsed materials. These voids determined survival. He came to rest within one of them. The pressure around him was uneven. Large sections of concrete and broken materials pressed from multiple directions, but not enough to fully crush the space he occupied. The gap was limited. Movement was restricted to minimal shifts of the head and limbs. Light did not reach him. Dust settled gradually after the collapse. In the immediate aftermath, the air was dense with particles, making breathing difficult. Each inhalation carried debris into the lungs. Over time, as the dust began to settle, the air became clearer, but the supply remained confined. Above ground, the shaking subsided within less than a minute. Below, the conditions had already stabilized into confinement. There were no clear pathways out, no visible exits. The structure that once defined interior and exterior space had become a compressed mass. Orientation was lost. Direction held no meaning in the darkness. Sound changed. Initial noise from the collapse, falling debris, structural failure, distant voices faded. In its place came intermittent sounds from the surface. Movement, calls, shifting material. These sounds were distant, filtered through layers of concrete and dust. For those trapped, communication depended on proximity and chance. Evans Monsignacq remained conscious after the collapse. This detail is supported by his survival over the following days. His condition in the first hours was defined by injury, disorientation, and the immediate need to regulate breathing within a confined space. The moment of collapse had ended. The situation it created did not. From this point forward, time would be measured differently, not by hours of daylight or routine activity, but by endurance within a space that did not change. The transition was complete. In the hours immediately following the collapse, the conditions around Evans Monsignacq remained largely unchanged. The space that had formed around him did not expand or contract in any noticeable way. It held, defined by the irregular alignment of broken concrete slabs and structural fragments. The stability of that space was uncertain, but it did not shift further. He could not stand. His body was positioned in a confined posture, limited by the weight and angle of the debris. Movement was restricted to small adjustments, slight turns of the head, minimal repositioning of his arms. His legs were pinned in a way that prevented any attempt to change position fully. The pressure was constant. Breathing required control. The air within the void was finite, but not sealed. Small gaps between materials allowed limited airflow. This prevented immediate suffocation, but the quality of the air remained poor. Dust particles lingered, and each breath required effort. Rapid breathing would have increased the strain, so survival depended, in part, on slowing it down. Above him, the city had already begun its response. Rescue efforts started within minutes in some areas, but coordination was limited. The scale of destruction was widespread. Thousands of structures had collapsed or sustained severe damage. Access routes were blocked. Equipment was scarce. Much of the initial search effort relied on individuals moving through debris by hand. For those buried deeper within the rubble, detection was inconsistent. Sound became the primary connection to the outside. In the early period after the collapse, voices could sometimes be heard. These were not always directed towards specific individuals. They carried through layers of debris in fragmented ways, shouts, calls, the movement of people above. At times, the sounds suggested proximity. At others, they faded completely. Evans Monsignac was able to make noise, but the effectiveness of that effort is uncertain. In confined spaces, sound does not travel in predictable paths. It is absorbed, redirected, or blocked entirely, depending on the materials surrounding it. Any attempt to signal would have depended on alignment with open channels through the debris. As the first day passed, the environment settled into a pattern. Light remained absent. There was no visual reference for time. The distinction between day and night could not be perceived directly. Instead, time had to be inferred through changes in external sound periods of increased activity, followed by quieter intervals. Water was not available in any direct form. Survival without water is limited. In the absence of an external source, the body begins to conserve fluids. Sweating decreases. Urination becomes less frequent. The sensation of thirst increases gradually, then persistently. Managing this process involves minimizing unnecessary movement and maintaining a controlled breathing pattern. Food was not a factor in the initial days. The human body can endure longer periods without food than without water. In situations of entrapment, energy conservation becomes more critical than intake. The reduction of movement, combined with a lowered metabolic demand, extends the window of survival. Injury is difficult to assess in such conditions. Evans Monsignac survived for 9 days, which suggests that any injuries he sustained during the collapse were not immediately fatal. However, prolonged pressure on parts of the body can lead to complications. Circulation may be restricted. Nerve compression can occur. Over time, these conditions can worsen, even without additional movement. The mental environment becomes a factor alongside the physical. In complete darkness, without clear markers of time or progress, orientation shifts inward. Awareness is focused on immediate sensations, breathing, pressure, sound. Maintaining a stable mental state is not a matter of optimism, but of consistency. Repetition becomes a structure. Breath, pause, listen. Outside, organized rescue operations began to increase in scale over the following days. International teams arrived with specialized equipment, acoustic sensors, thermal imaging devices, trained search dogs. These tools improved the ability to locate survivors beneath rubble. However, their effectiveness depended on access and the condition of the debris fields. In densely collapsed areas, reaching deeper voids remained difficult. As time progressed, the likelihood of survival generally decreased. Many rescues occurred within the first 48 to 72 hours. Beyond that period, successful recoveries became less frequent. This did not mean they were impossible, but they required a specific set of conditions: air pockets, manageable injuries, and a degree of physiological resilience. Evans Monsignac remained within those conditions. His position, while restrictive, provided a small but critical margin. The void did not collapse further. Air continued to circulate at a minimal level. His body endured the pressure and dehydration longer than expected in such circumstances. By the 3rd and 4th days, the pattern of sound from above began to change. Initial chaos gave way to more deliberate activity. The noise of random movement was gradually replaced by focused efforts, tools against debris, coordinated calls, intervals of listening. Rescue teams often paused to detect any response from beneath. Whether these efforts reached him directly is not fully documented. In many cases, survivors remained unheard even when rescuers were nearby. The structure of the debris could isolate sound entirely. In other instances, faint signals were enough to guide a search. Time continued without clear division. The absence of light removed external pacing. The body's internal rhythms began to adjust. Sleep, if it occurred, was irregular and shallow. Waking and resting blurred together. The distinction between hours lost its clarity. Physical strength diminished gradually. Dehydration affects the body in stages. Early symptoms include thirst and dry mouth. As it progresses, fatigue increases. Cognitive function can become impaired. Movement becomes more difficult. However, in low-activity conditions, the decline can extend over several days. Evans-Monsignac's survival through this period indicates a balance between limited physical exertion and the body's ability to endure. The environment around him did not provide relief, but it did not worsen abruptly. There were no sudden shifts in the debris, no additional collapses that altered his position significantly. Stability, in this context, allowed time to continue. Above ground, the search did not stop. Rescue teams continued to work through debris fields, often returning to areas multiple times. The process involved clearing layers, reassessing spaces, and listening for any indication of life. Progress was slow. Each section required careful handling to avoid triggering further collapse. In the space beneath the rubble, the passage of time was not marked by visible change. It was measured in endurance. By the later stages of entrapment, the conditions within the void began to shift in more noticeable ways, not in structure, but in effect. The space remained intact, but the body within it continued to change. Dehydration had advanced. Without access to water for several days, the body's internal reserves were significantly reduced. The sensation of thirst, present early on, had likely intensified and then altered. In extreme cases, thirst becomes less sharp and more constant, replaced by fatigue and reduced awareness. The mouth dries. The ability to swallow becomes more difficult. Movement, already limited, became less frequent. Energy conservation was no longer a choice, but a necessity. Even small adjustments required effort. Muscles weaken without use and under sustained pressure. Circulation slows in compressed areas. Any attempt to reposition would have been gradual and incomplete. The air remained breathable, but unchanged. In confined environments, oxygen levels can decrease over time, depending on airflow. In this case, small gaps in the debris continued to allow limited exchange. This prevented immediate suffocation, but the quality of the air was still compromised. Each breath carried strain. Sound from above continued, but less frequently. In the initial days after the earthquake, activity had been widespread and continuous. Over time, as areas were cleared and priorities shifted, the density of rescue operations changed. Some locations received sustained attention. Others became quieter, not abandoned, but less active at any given moment. For someone beneath multiple layers of debris, these changes affected perception. Intervals of sound may have suggested proximity, then distance. The absence of noise did not necessarily mean absence of people. It meant that activity had moved, paused, or become too distant to detect through the material above. Time could no longer be estimated with any reliability. Without light or consistent sound patterns, the distinction between one day and the next dissolved. The body's internal sense of time, based on cycles of rest and wakefulness, became irregular. Sleep, if it occurred, would have been shallow and fragmented. Waking did not bring change in environment. Physical decline continued in stages. After several days without water, the body enters a more critical phase. Blood volume decreases. Heart rate can increase as the body attempts to maintain circulation. Cognitive clarity diminishes. Reactions slow. The ability to generate body heat may be affected. Despite this, survival remained possible. Cases of extended entrapment after earthquakes have shown that individuals can endure beyond expected limits when certain conditions are met. Minimal movement, partial airflow, and the absence of severe crush injuries extend the window. Evans-Monsignac remained within that narrow range. There is limited documentation of his exact condition during each day of entrapment. What is known comes from the duration, 9 days beneath rubble, and his eventual recovery. From this, it can be inferred that his body, while weakened, continued to function within survivable thresholds. Psychological pressure does not present in visible ways in such environments. There are no external expressions to observe, no interactions to record. The experience becomes internal. Awareness narrows to immediate sensations: breath, pressure, sound. The absence of visual input removes external reference points. The mind operates without orientation to space. In some cases, individuals attempt to mark time or maintain routine mentally. There is no record of specific strategies used in this instance. However, survival over extended confinement often involves repetition, counting breaths, focusing on consistent patterns of thought, or simply maintaining stillness. As the days progressed, the probability of discovery generally decreased. Most rescues occur within the first few days after a collapse. Beyond that period, search operations continue, but expectations shift. The presence of survivors becomes less likely in statistical terms, though not impossible. For those still alive beneath the debris, this shift is not directly perceived. There is no awareness of changing probabilities, only the continuation of conditions. Above ground, rescue teams continued to revisit collapsed structures. International assistance had expanded the capacity for search operations. Equipment allowed for more precise detection in some areas, but access remained a limiting factor. In dense debris fields, reaching deeper voids required time. Each layer had to be removed or navigated carefully. Heavy machinery could not be used indiscriminately, as it risked causing further collapse. Manual clearing remained a primary method in many locations. At some point during the 9th day, activity returned to the area above where Evans-Monsignac was trapped. The reasons for this return are not fully detailed. It may have been part of a systematic search or prompted by a signal, sound, movement, or detection through equipment. In many rescue cases, rediscovery occurs not through a single action, but through repeated passes over the same location. Beneath the debris, conditions had not improved. The space remained unchanged. The body within it had weakened further. The capacity to signal, if it existed, would have been reduced. And yet, the presence of life persisted. In environments where time loses structure and external reference disappears, survival becomes a continuation without markers. There is no clear transition from one stage to another, only the gradual accumulation of hours under constant pressure. On the 9th day, that accumulation reached a point where it intersected with those searching above. The separation between them was no longer absolute. On the 9th day after the earthquake, activity resumed in the area above the collapsed structure where Evans-Monsignac remained trapped. Search and rescue teams had continued working across Port-au-Prince, often revisiting sites multiple times. The process was not linear. Areas cleared once could be reassessed based on new information, shifting priorities, or the possibility that earlier efforts had not reached deeper voids. At this location, the return was deliberate. Rescuers moved across the debris with controlled steps, listening between actions. This pattern work, pause, listen, was standard in later-stage search operations. By this point, heavy noise was minimized when possible. Detection relied on faint signals, tapping, movement, or any indication of human presence. At some stage during this process, a sign was identified. Accounts indicate that Monsignac was located after responders detected signs of life beneath the rubble. The exact method, whether through sound, movement, or equipment, is not consistently documented. In many similar rescues, discovery occurs through a combination of methods rather than a single clear signal. Once a potential survivor is identified, the process changes. Excavation becomes precise. Rescuers begin to remove debris in controlled sections, avoiding any shift that could collapse the void below. Large pieces are stabilized or cut away. Smaller fragments are cleared by hand. The pace is slow, measured in careful adjustments rather than rapid progress. Communication may be attempted during this phase. If the survivor is conscious and able to respond, rescuers try to establish contact. In some cases, this involves calling out, listening for replies, or using tools to amplify sound. Whether direct communication was established with Monsignac before extraction is not fully recorded. What is known is that he was alive when reached. The removal of debris continued until access to the void was created. This process can take hours, depending on the density and arrangement of materials. The goal is not speed, but stability. A premature shift in weight can cause secondary collapse. When the opening was sufficient, rescuers reached him. After 9 days beneath the rubble, his condition reflected prolonged dehydration, immobility, and confinement. Such survivors are typically unable to move independently. Extraction requires support to prevent further injury, particularly if limbs have been under pressure for extended periods. Once removed from the void, immediate medical attention becomes necessary. The transition from confinement to open air is not a simple recovery. The body must adjust gradually. In some cases, rapid changes in circulation after prolonged compression can lead to complications. Medical teams monitor breathing, hydration, and vital signs from the moment of extraction. Monsignac was transported for treatment. His survival placed him among a smaller number of individuals recovered after extended periods beneath the rubble. By the 9th day, such rescues were less common, but they continued to occur under specific conditions. Above ground, the city remained in a state of disruption. Rescue efforts were still ongoing. The scale of loss was already clear, though not yet fully measured. Structures remained unstable. Many areas had yet to be cleared. The extraction of one individual did not alter the broader situation. It marked the end of a confined period for him, but not the end of the event itself. The removal of Evans Monsignac from the rubble did not conclude the conditions that had led to his entrapment. It marked a transition from isolation beneath debris to recovery within a system already under strain. Medical treatment focused first on stabilization. After prolonged confinement without water, the body requires gradual rehydration. Fluids are introduced carefully to avoid complications. Circulation, affected by sustained pressure and immobility, must be monitored. Muscles weakened by inactivity do not immediately regain function. Recovery, in such cases, is measured over time rather than in immediate change. Details of his long-term recovery are limited in public records. What remains documented is the duration of his survival, 9 days beneath collapsed concrete, and the conditions that made it possible. A void that did not close, air that continued to circulate, injuries that, while serious, did not prevent continued life. These factors, combined, placed him within a narrow margin where survival could extend beyond expectation. Around him, the broader context remained unchanged. The earthquake of the 12th of January, 2010, resulted in widespread destruction across Haiti. Port-au-Prince, as the most densely affected urban center, experienced extensive structural collapse. Casualty estimates reached into the hundreds of thousands. Infrastructure, medical, governmental, and logistical was heavily disrupted. Rescue operations continued in the days following his extraction. International teams, local responders, and volunteers worked across multiple sites, often under limited resources. Each recovery, whether of a survivor or a victim, required time and coordination. As days passed, the nature of the work shifted gradually from search and rescue toward recovery and stabilization. Monsignac's survival remained part of a smaller set of extended rescues. These cases are not defined by extraordinary action in a visible sense. They are defined by alignment of environment, timing, and physical endurance. Survival under rubble is not a controlled process. It depends on conditions that cannot be adjusted once collapse has occurred. His experience does not include recorded dialogue, planned decisions, or visible progression. It consists of duration. 9 days without light, without direct access to water, within a space that did not change, under weight that did not lift until others reached him. The passage of time in that environment was not marked by events, but by continuation. In historical records of earthquakes, such survivals serve a specific role. They demonstrate the limits of human endurance under confinement. They also inform search strategies, reinforcing the value of extended efforts even when probabilities decrease. Each case contributes to an understanding of how long survival may persist under certain conditions. The city, over time, began to rebuild. Structures were cleared, replaced, or reinforced. Systems were gradually restored. The fault line beneath the region remained, unchanged in its presence. The pressure within the Earth would continue to accumulate over time, as it had before. Above ground, life resumed in stages. Below ground, the forces that caused the collapse remained part of the same system. Monsignac's survival exists within that larger context, not as an isolated event, but as one outcome among many shaped by the same moment. There is no clear resolution to the conditions that created it. Only the record that, for 9 days beneath the rubble, life continued in silence and was found before it ended.